What does the Bible have to say about mental health? Is that a phrase or a concept that Christians should use? Stay tuned for the discussion. This is the Bible Sojourner, where we discuss issues related to the Bible, theology, and culture. I'm your host, Peter Gaiman, professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Shepherd's Theological Seminary. Shalom and welcome. Thanks for joining. Welcome back to another Bible Sojourner episode. It's a pleasure to be with you. And today is May, and I got a listener question recently about the issue of mental health. If you didn't know, we have the month of May signifying Mental Health Awareness Month. And so I thought it'd be a great opportunity to talk about something that I've been meaning to talk about for quite some time, and that's the issue of mental health and how Christians should think about that whole concept and construct, and whether or not we should actually affirm even using that language. Now, I fully acknowledge that this is a very potent issue for people. This is something where everybody knows somebody dear to them that either uses this phrase or understands that this is something that affects multiple people. And so I want to talk about this circumspectly, and I'm not going to come down saying this is exactly, the black and white issue of it. I'm going to give us some black and white principles, but ultimately we need to talk about this because I think as Christians, we often don't talk about the issue surrounding mental health and some of the presuppositions that are brought into play. So I want to try to do this in a responsible way, and understanding that this isn't just a Christian, non-Christian, right versus left issue. In fact, just by way of illustration to show you how much this is prevalent in people's mindset, you often have even those on the conservative end of the spectrum, whenever there's some sort of mass shooting or anything like that, typically the response is, oh, this isn't a gun issue, this is a mental health issue. And what exactly they mean by that is kind of a debate. That's kind of why we're doing this episode, because there are some loaded implications even of that. Now, I think that there are more complications to life than just substituting mental health as a fill-in statement. And I think as Christians, we really need to be specific about what exactly we're talking about. And I would propose that there may even be a strong argument to say we as Christians are better off not using the term mental health because of the connotations that the world uses. Now, in order to defend that and bring that to bear, let's define some things. We'll work through some definitions here. So what I tried to do is I just tried to run Google searches, and I used Google because that's the preferred search engine of most people, even though I don't use that anymore. But I used Google and I tried to just run some generic searches to get the top results, because what that means is that Google and their algorithms think that these are the top results of people running these searches, and the algorithm says these are the things that people find most useful. So in running the search, what is mental health? This was one of the top hits. It's from a website known as Medical News Today, and it relies heavily on the World Health Organization, so another heavy hitter, and it simply defines mental health this way. Mental health is a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realize their abilities, learn well and work well, and contribute to their community. So in other words, this is a very generic, broad statement, and when the article goes on to explain what the World Health Organization means, the article defines it this way. Peak mental health is not only about managing active conditions, but also looking after ongoing wellness and happiness. Okay. Now, it's interesting, as the article goes on, you can actually see some of the questionable presuppositions in how they would advocate for mental health. For example, in their factors which mental health, or in the factors where mental health is in jeopardy, some of the uncontrollable factors would be things like age, ethnicity, nationality, and they also include gender. But then on factors that can be changed, they include gender as something that can be changed in order to help with your mental health. And so obviously as Christians, we would reject that and understand, well, wait a second, already out of the gate, there are some elements of this mental health dynamic which we wouldn't hold to, we couldn't agree to. And that's going to be the order of the day, is that there are some things that are correct about these observations being made by mental health officials, but we should also recognize that there are some presuppositions that we as Christians could never hold to. Now, I want to throw out another definition as well. So that was the World Health Organization. And in the explanation of how that works, we saw some potential problems that we'll come back to in just a moment. I'm just trying to set the stage, just trying to give some introductory definitions here before we continue on. And the CDC defines mental health. Mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make healthy choices. Mental health is important at every stage of life, from childhood and adolescence through adulthood. Now, I'm just going to say, reading the CDC, World Health Organization's definitions, I don't have a major problem with those definitions, at least not with how they're worded. At the most basic level, they're basically just, as words on the page, describing something that we all understand and intuitively recognize, that there are elements of life that affect us, whether that be social, how we think, even our rest. All those things are acknowledged as true. Now, if that was just the end of the story, just saying, well, when we're referring to mental health, we are referring to the fact that you need to eat correctly, you need to watch who you hang out with, and you need to sleep appropriately. Okay, well, yeah, we could definitely all get behind that. But the problem is that these definitions don't actually go into all the detail about what mental health is really targeting and what this whole construct of really discipline. It's a medical discipline, or it's a psychological discipline in many ways, psychiatric discipline rather. You have this pursuit of happiness. You have this pursuit of removing difficulties of life, and in all of that, and some of that is actually helpful, what they recommend. I'm not even denying that. But the ultimate goal is different, because in all of these descriptions, there's never a definition of what you're actually trying to achieve. What is the state of true healthiness or true normal? What are we actually trying to achieve? And that is surprisingly, perhaps, left absent from the discussion. In fact, I was listening to somebody lecture on this recently, and they mentioned that in the DSM, which is basically the textbook for mental disorders, and trying to help people understand these kinds of elements from a secular worldview, it's interesting that I think in last count, there were over 450 potential diagnostics for how to label somebody as being abnormal. But throughout the whole DSM, there's not a discussion about what it actually looks like to be normal. And so it is kind of interesting, because in this whole discussion from the secular worldview, they don't actually know what a normal or appropriate, quote unquote, mental health would be. And I think that that's part of the problem. There's no consensus as to what we ought to think or what we ought to feel or how we ought to act. In fact, in some of the discussions about what are warning signs of mental health, I'm going to list some from you again. You just do a search, what are the symptoms of mental health issues, and these would be some of the top results. So, for example, feeling anxious or worried, feeling unhappy. So just think about that. They're saying feeling unhappy is unnatural. Feeling unhappy is wrong. Now, I don't want to tip my hat too much here, but I would say from a biblical worldview, I'm going to say that being unhappy is a part of living in a fallen world, and we should expect that. And that's not abnormal in some circumstances. If you live a life where you are never unhappy, I think you're actually a part of the matrix. I believe that is correct. And we just need to understand living in a fallen world is going to communicate unhappiness to us, because we're going to suffer. We're going to live in what I'm going to keep referring to as the Ecclesiastes worldview. And so some of these things that they're listing, so I just stopped right there, but feeling anxious, feeling unhappy, feeling depressed, emotional outbursts, sleep problems, weight or appetite changes, being quiet or withdrawn, substance abuse, feeling guilty or worthless, or certain other changes in behavior or feelings. Now, I'll just say that a lot of those are natural. I think a lot of those are natural. There are certain times of life where you just go through sleep issues because of sickness, because of other things going on in your life. Now, I'll just say there are also some of these things that are flat out identified as sins in the Bible, and we're going to talk about that too. So all of these things that are listed as signs of mental health issues, I think that we actually have a better way of talking about these from a biblical worldview. And so we're going to talk about this in more detail, but generally, as a just a generic principle starting point, one of the things I think we need to recognize is that as much as possible, we should be seeking to define things biblically, right? Let's look at the Bible, see what the Bible has to say, and then try to define our experiences in light of the Bible. We don't interpret the Bible in light of our experiences, right? That is foundational to the Christian worldview, is understanding that the Bible trumps experience every time. Now, so after defining mental health and kind of giving an introductory thought on that, I want to just ask the question, is the idea of mental health compatible with the Christian worldview? So what we're starting to define and see, is it compatible with the Christian worldview? Now, I know even many people listening or watching this are going to say, I use that phrase. I have friends and family who use that phrase. Don't you dare tell me that it's sinful to use that phrase. And I'm not saying, I would never say it's sinful to use, okay, I have to back up, because I would say I could see circumstances where it would be sinful, just like other phrases. But I'm not going to say inherently that phrase is sinful at all. But what I'm saying is we need to think analytically about this. And in order to do that, I think it's important to take a step back, analyze the historical process or the history behind this term. Okay. So the history of mental health is rather fascinating. And I enjoyed doing some reading, brushing up on my history, listening to some lectures on it. And basically in the late 1800s, this is an important backdrop. In the late 1800s, you had these psychiatric hospitals and asylums being present in the United States. And they were established to house or to treat people who had mental illness, according to the definition of that day. Now, the problem is, part of those definitions of mental illnesses then were just, I don't like how you're thinking or how you're acting. Often they would call it madness in certain regards. And without question, people had problems. Certainly people had problems. But these institutions were often overcrowded. They often didn't give effective treatment. In fact, they often treated people in ways that were rather dangerous or unethical. So, for example, people would experiment with water therapies, with some kind of water pressure, high pressure showers, cold baths, ice baths, hot baths. They would do fever therapies. They would even do things like teeth removal or bloodletting. I even read of something that was called the tranquilizer chair. And what they would do in the tranquilizer chair is they would restrain a patient. They would strap them down into a chair and sometimes leave them there for days, hours or days. They would just leave them there without food or water to try to help them, to teach them, this is not what you need to do, etc. Now, obviously, we look at those things and we think, well, that is extremely unethical and just inhumane how they are treated. That we would expect that out of some sort of horror movie or something like that. But this is how people were trying to deal with people who couldn't be, something was wrong with them, but they couldn't see anything physically wrong with them. So they would try these different experiments and scenarios in these asylums and try to figure out if any of these things were effective. And sometimes they claimed, these things were effective. Sometimes they claimed that they weren't. Now, there was an individual by the name of Clifford Beers who actually, he wound up in one of these asylums, and he threw himself out of a 3-story window trying to commit suicide. He ended up winding up in an asylum, and he just realized firsthand just how ineffective they were. So he kind of spearheaded a movement in the early 20th century, early 1900s, where basically there was a shift away from these psychiatric centers and toward what became known as the mental hygiene movement. So the mental hygiene movement which eventually becomes known really as mental health. Those phrases are linked. So you can look up all this, by the way. The mental hygiene movement is essentially tied with a understanding that many of these problems that are present in individuals are tied to social or environmental factors. So somebody's cultural influences, their social or environmental factors contribute to the mental distress. And so this is why when we think about a secular worldview, by the way, this is something I've said before, but we need to re-emphasize. You're basically tied down in your options. You're very limited for trying to understand how problems arise in life. So on the one hand, you can describe things environmentally. You might say, why is it that this person was a serial killer? Why is it this person is broken? What is the cause? Because we know from a secular worldview that we're fine. We're a blank slate, if you will. We cannot say from a secular worldview, we have no basis to say that humanity is basically evil inherently, such as the belief of Christianity. We call it total depravity. Mankind is born on the evil team, as it were. But for the secularist, how do they describe that? So they've tried to come up with two different viewpoints. One is like this. There's a social environmental cause. So somebody grows up and there's something in society that pushes him toward evil. Maybe it's his friends, maybe it's his parents, maybe it's, as we've heard most recently in the different social theories, maybe it's oppressive power structures, white supremacy, etc. So remember, mankind is basically innocent, but there are things pushing him toward his evil action. So you have that as a backdrop, but you also have another viewpoint in theory, which takes a variety of forms, but it's basically the idea that genetics or your biology determines who you are. So maybe this is, we've heard things about the chemical imbalance theory. Nobody in the medical community believes that to be the case, but there are certainly people day to day who still think, oh, maybe somebody is acting this way because there are chemicals out of balance in their brain or something like that. Now, there's no evidence for that in the medical community, and so doctors and psychiatrists wouldn't say that. But it was such a prevalent theory at one point that many people still think, oh, this is probably what's going on. Maybe there was a gene that this person had that made them have more anger issues than other people, or maybe they're predisposed to drinking because they have a certain gene, or maybe they have more chemicals in their brain than others for this, and so that leads to a certain action. So basically, from a secular worldview, you're going to have these two explanations for, and there may be variations of these, but environment or biology. Those are the two ways to try to process these things. And so in the mid-20th century, this mental health movement shifted from the mental hygiene to the treatment of mental illness. And basically, some of these desires to treat these issues comes from trying to filter things through this. Let's try with environment. Let's try with treating psychotropic drugs. For example, if we see somebody acting erratically, let's give him these drugs, and if that produces the kind of change we want to see in that individual, then we'll count that as a success. In fact, it may interest some people to know that in the use of psychotropic drugs, a lot of times people don't know exactly how they work. They just understand, well, they are producing the right effect, or what we are trying to look for in children who are acting out, or in adults who are suffering in some way. And so the end often is justifying the means with regard to taking drugs like that. Now, I'm not saying that there's never a time and place for certain medications, and I'm trying not to come down and say, well, listen, never should you ever take drugs for anything. Never should you. No, I'm not saying any of that. What I'm saying is you have to understand this history, though. You have to understand the backdrop in order to have a full appreciation. Now, that doesn't mean that we should, there are many cases. I know, in fact, a couple people right now who are suffering from real biological issues, and they take medicine that they're not sure why it helps, but it's helping. And so they do that. And so I'm not saying that that's a disclaimer, or we shouldn't take medication because we don't know exactly how it works. But I'm saying this is part of the process of the mental health movement, going from mental hygiene to mental health. So if you want to summarize, originally you had this response, and it's a very good response, by the way. I would applaud and say, yes, recognizing the unethical treatment of people in the asylums and things like that was very helpful and important. And so to recognize, okay, we need to do something different and love these people and try to find actual effective treatment is what's important. And as people were going down that road, they tried all different things. Now, again, they're not coming at it largely from a Christian worldview. There may have been exceptions in that. But by and large, this mental hygiene, which leads to the mental health movement, is going to be coming at it from a secular worldview, trying to fix people by changing the environment around them, right? So if you are suffering, if you are sad, you change the things that make you sad, right? Putting your hope on the here and now, adjusting your life in order to be more acceptable in your eyes, to make you happier. So let's talk a little bit more about the implications of embracing this mental health paradigm. And in order to do this, I want to, again, use one of Google's top results here. And I was just searching for why is mental health important, or why should we embrace mental health? And Google, gave me a website from lifehack.org, and it gives 3 reasons why mental health is so important. So again, my goal here is just using the most accessed websites on Google. So if somebody were searching this, these are the kinds of things that they would see. Google is prioritizing these results for whatever reason. People find these most helpful, and so they spend the most time on these websites. And so in looking through this section, we are told why mental health is so important. And first of all, it gives some statistics, which you may find interesting. It basically says 1 in 5 adults in America experience mental illness, which is about 18.5% of our population. They give the exact percentage there. Now, that's probably actually higher now. Ultimately, this is one of those things where it just seems to keep growing generation by generation. More and more people identify these ways. And I can't remember the exact statistics about people who are on medication for mental illness, but it's very high as well. And I remember reading that a couple of years ago, and the number escapes me. But this is just something that is very, very common in the United States. And so the question is, well, why is this? How should we think about this? And this is from the article. I want to zero in on just a few paragraphs here, because it talks about why mental health is important to talk about. So mental health, this is from the article, mental health is a topic that gets stigmatized so often in our society. If someone is having a mental health issue, they are less likely to get help because of that stigma and shame. Now, here's the important part of their assessment. Now, if you're listening, you'll understand based on our previous conversation why they say what they say. But there's nothing to be ashamed of. The wirings of your brain are not your fault. Yet we act like it is our fault and discount its importance. So notice what's going on there. And this is something that we just, as Christians, we need to be really aware of, because what's being assumed here, the phrase, the wirings of your brain are not your fault, right? So what it's saying is you acting or experiencing this anxiety or this sadness or, you fill in the blank there. These things are not your fault. Your actions had nothing to do with it. And the reality is that it's just the way that your brain is wired. And so this is a problem from a Christian worldview, right? We would advocate strongly for the personal responsibility of an individual, right? And so this is one thing where you see it in these popular articles where they say, listen, it's nothing to be ashamed of. You're not responsible for how you're made, right? This is the exact same arguments that when the pro-LGBT community was arguing for the acceptance and embrace of homosexual marriage, what they said was, we are born this way, right? Now, as I've talked about in the past, that actually became an outdated argument almost immediately, because they didn't want to be labeled as people who had a disease or mental inferiority. And so they said, no, we actually choose this lifestyle. But traditionally, that's always been one of the ways that they've argued for acceptance, is saying, well, we haven't chosen this. We were just born this way. But then, like I said, everybody rejects that argument now unless they're in an argument and they want to appeal to a throwback. But this is something that's very common in the culture, in the secular worldview, is just to view the human existence, the human experience as a interaction of chemicals. I mean, what's different in the human being compared to just pouring together a Coca-Cola and a Mountain Dew, right? It's just the interaction of chemicals, and it's going to dissolve whatever it touches, obviously, but we still drink it. But what's the difference? A chemical interaction, external, chemical interaction, internal. Now, as Christians, we reject all that. We understand that we're made in the image of God. We understand that we have personal responsibility for our actions, all these things. We understand that there's something deeper to that. Now, as the article goes on, this is another important point to observe. So it says mental illness gets misunderstood by those who have never experienced it. It becomes up to us to advocate for our needs and educate others about our issues. We become experts of lived experience. So if you've listened to this podcast for a while, this was a while back, but I did some podcast episodes on critical race theory, and I've done some on LGBT issues. And some of the stuff that I've talked about with regard to that is this viewpoint, which is very prominent in secularism, where experience trumps everything. Experience is the highest form of knowledge. And that's not true. That's not true at all by any stretch of the imagination. But we often live that way, and the secular world pushes that. And so a lot of times there's this idea that you must experience something to truly know it. And if you do not have any experience, you do not have the right to have an opinion on it, for example. And so you get that in the abortion debate. You're not a woman, you can't talk about it. Oh, you are a woman. Well, then it doesn't matter. We still don't want to listen to you. Those kinds of things. Or you have people, you can't have an opinion on racism because you're not a person of color. Oh, you're a person of color and you still have a viewpoint different than us. You're just embracing the white worldview as the white supremacy oppressors have constructed this oppressive system, and you've just bought into it. And you also have, you've not only bought into it, but you've also embraced and profited from it. So the wheel just continues to spin. And I just want to point out that this is not this. Now, as Christians, we definitely understand that experience is a valid form of understanding and learning things. But where we would definitely have to push back is that experience is not the determining factor of knowledge, right? We would hold to Scripture as being the primary way we learn something, we know something, and then we can apply something. And so this is a very, very crucial part of the discussion in so many issues. But here again, in the issue of mental health, we need to understand, okay, people's experiences are real. And that's part of the attractive nature of just the whole mental health experience, is they describe our experiences so well. They describe how we're sleepless. They describe how we don't have any appetite to eat anymore. And those are things that we go through. And so when we're going through those things, we say, well, yeah, they've hit that exactly on the head. They know this. So then maybe their solutions are also correct. But that's an incorrect leap of logic, is just because they describe the symptoms correctly doesn't necessarily mean this entire push for solutions to these issues is actually correct. So I want to really wrestle with this, and I want to give just in the rest of our time here a couple thoughts on how to think through this issue, the issue of mental health from a biblical worldview. And I think that these may be helpful. And again, like I said, I'm not here to say, you use the term mental health or anything like, and you are therefore an inferior Christian, whatever. No, that's not my point. My point is to have this conversation and to help us think through this issue, because we ought to be thinking about what is actually going on behind the scenes. And I think minimally what we have to know is that you need to understand secularists, those who have rejected God, are using terms differently than you. So here's a couple principles thinking about it from a biblical worldview, and I want to pick up right there. because the first thing to understand is that people use terms differently. All right, so people use terms differently. Not everyone uses terms the same way or with the same intentions. Now, do I jump over Christians for using these terms? No. But one of the things that you have to understand is that if a secularist is using these terms, they are coming at it with a much different worldview and much different presuppositions. And so we do need wisdom and grace in dealing with one another, absolutely. But I would say that words have meaning, and oftentimes the meaning that most people are understanding when we use a phrase is actually different than what we might be intending, at least in cases like this with the idea of mental health. Now, I recently listened to an individual named Dale Johnson talk about this issue, and I love the illustration he gave. And I know we have some international listeners in the audience, and so one of the things that will make perfect sense to them is the idea of football, right? For the American, football has a great and glorious pastime. I mean, what could be better than watching grown men fight over a pigskin, But the issue is when you say football in America, you mean something. But if you were talking to a European audience and you said, hey, would you like to play some football? And they said, oh, sure. Yeah, awesome. Let's do it. Well, you each have in your mind a different concept of what that is going to entail or what that's going to look like. And so this is a similar concept where we as Christians might say, oh, yeah, definitely watch out for your mental health. And we need to be appreciating our mental health. That's just important for us, is we need to be advocating for mental health. And, that sounds well and good, and we're doing it in a loving way. But in reality, what the world means by that subject, by that concept, is much different than how we are supposedly using it, at least if we're embracing a biblical worldview. And the world does this all the time. This is a very important lesson to internalize as Christians, that the world defines things and changes language in order to communicate something which we cannot get behind as believers. And I'm not saying mental health is exactly the same way as these illustrations I'm about to give, but the exact this is similar to what's going on with the whole abortion versus non-abortion movement. You have abortionists have reclassified themselves, and they reclassify themselves as pro-choice. Now, let me ask you something. Are you against saying I am for making decisions? No, you are not against that. And so you could actually use that term. You could say, yeah, I am pro-choice, but you're not pro-choice in the sense that they are saying, because their advocation of being pro-choice means that they want to prepare the choice to kill a baby, right? You want the freedom of choice to kill a baby. And that is something far different than what you mean when you say pro-choice. Obviously, you know that. Actually, something very similar took place during the whole 2020 summer fiasco with the whole Black Lives Matter movement. And it was a big debate among Christians is we need to say Black Lives Matter, blah, blah, blah. And the interesting thing is that statement true? Black Lives Matter? Yes, of course, Black Lives Matter. But it's the exact same thing happened. And you could actually see this in how everyone formulated the phrases, and even the very existence of the Black Lives Matter group. They mean something far different than just, oh yes, we recognize the individual lives of Black people. Obviously, even their website said, we need to prioritize destroying the Western nuclear family, blah blah blah. And it's like, okay, yeah, they mean something far, far different. Than what we as Christians, we want to say, yes, we do appreciate the life of every single ethnicity out there, and we recognize that. Amen. But that's not at all what was going on. Similar concept would be like even the redefinition of adultery to affair. Like, yeah, well, what's so wrong with that? Well, now we understand that what people mean when they're referring to affair. But the point is that language is often softened, is changed, is made to conceptualize something that might not be so off-putting. but the whole construct behind it is not biblical. It's actually, and this is, you might say, I'm going too far, but most of these concepts actually arise from demons. These are what the Bible refers to as doctrines of demons. And you might say, wait a second, no. Well, let me just ask you, if it's not of God, where is it from? James makes it clear there are two choices, right? Doctrine of God, the wisdom from above, or from the world, from demons, right? So when we think about this, if something is not coinciding with the biblical worldview, then it is coming from somewhere else. And let's just say it's not coming from God, so the alternatives are rather limited. So not everyone uses the same language with the same intentions, and so we need to be careful not to fall into those traps. And I'm not saying that there's never a time and a place to use the term mental health, but I would say from the secular worldview, the concept of mental health is much different. And so that brings me to the second major takeaway here for the thinking through the issue of mental health from a biblical worldview. The second thing I would point out is that this whole concept of mental health, as it's used by the world in the secular worldview, it teaches us to look for the answer to our brokenness by fixing our circumstances. So in other words, the secular world tells us if you want to be happy, if you want to experience true happiness and fulfillment, all you need to do is fix your circumstances, because then you can be happy, because then you will be able to fully experience life as you are supposed to. And the reality is that this is, again, antithetical to the biblical worldview. The Bible nowhere says that fixing our circumstances is the answer or the solution to our problems, right? In fact, the Bible assumes that we are going to undergo persecution, that we are going to suffer sickness, we're going to suffer death, and that's an important reality to understand. In fact, if you compare the world's way of dealing things versus how the Bible deals with something, if I'm stressing out or anxious over something, we basically are taught by the world, if you're stressing or anxious about something, all you need to do is change your environment, change your circumstances, and then you're better able to deal with the stress. But that teaches us to look to ourselves to changing the circumstance as the solution, right? But from the biblical perspective, how are we to think about that? Well, the Bible says, listen, the outward circumstances, the things that you're dealing with externally are not the issue. What's the issue is what's happening in the heart. Anxiety comes from the heart. And so it's a very, and that's, I think anxiety is a great illustration of this, because for the world, anxiety is it's a mental health issue. That's what they'd say. It's like, oh yeah, totally understandable. You're just overloaded. You just have too much going on. It's your external factors are making you anxious. But from the Bible, Jesus doesn't say, think about, the Sermon on the Mount would have looked quite a bit different if in Matthew 6, Jesus said, you know what, if you are anxious, just put some of those things away and adjust your circumstances so that your mental health is better. And then you will be able to serve God with more joy or something like that. But instead, Jesus basically, and I love teaching through Matthew 6, one of the things that's so precious there is he just flat out says, don't be anxious, like be anxious for nothing. And one of the illustrations he uses there is that, look at all of the birds of the field, God takes care of them. And he basically says, when you worry, you are acting like an unbeliever, because don't you know God? Don't you know that God will provide for you? And so Jesus doesn't say, look to your external circumstances. He says, look to me, look to the Father, and we will provide what you need. And so anxiety, yes, it's something that we all deal with in a certain way, but the world teaches us to deal with it differently than the Bible teaches us to deal with it. The Bible teaches us to confess that as sin and deal with it, processing it in our hearts, understanding that we are not trusting in Jesus as we ought to. And so we confess, forsake that, and we take steps to apply that. And again, I'm not saying that the Bible doesn't say we should be circumspect about our situation, that we can and we should seek to avoid temptation by overdoing it. We don't want to overdo it. So perhaps you limit how much you do. That's wise. but there's a difference in trajectory. There's a difference in motive there, right? And so there's a difference between saying, yeah, it's wise to control our circumstances versus that is the key to everything, right? And so, like I said, I don't even mind some of the advice that is given by people. Oh, you're overdoing something. You need to take more steps on that. Controlling everything. That's fine. But the ultimate goal is different. The concept of mental health says the brokenness that we see is alleviated or fixed by changing our circumstances. The Bible says that pursuing Christ is the key. That is the hope that we can utilize in our day-to-day life. We find hope in the life to come through Christ, not through changing our circumstances. As I was thinking about this, I can't, and maybe you're thinking about this too, because I can't help but just think about how soft our generations are now. You just think people say, "Oh, I've suffered so much. I experienced so much trauma, and I'm just recovering that now, and I need counseling because something terrible has happened to me." Now, I'm not saying that there's not a time and place for that, right? But I'm just saying it's so much more prevalent in our society. And you just think about some of the people of the past, what they had to go through. And I love reading history, and some of those people went through a lot. I mean, you just think about even Christian history. You had people like Ignatius and Polycarp. Their parents were martyred when they were children. And so you think to yourself, well, I guess that's pretty traumatic, right? I mean, as a kid, seeing your parents killed because they embraced Christ as their Savior and Lord. And then as this child grows up, he's rather than dwelling on that difficulty and letting that quote unquote traumatize him, he says, you know what? I will serve the Lord my entire life. And that's just an amazing, amazing testimony. And those kinds of testimonies are the reality for so many Christians. And so I just think that that's one of those things that we miss a lot. We forget that people have gone through so much difficulty in the past. It is kind of crazy that what we've experienced today in today's culture in America is such a luxurious lifestyle, and yet so many people are suffering, quote unquote, suffering, because it's people have made jokes about first world problems, and I think part of the reason, I guess this will lead into the third point, because part of the point is that when you adopt this worldview, this secular worldview of striving for mental health, removing the stresses and difficulties of life, when you succeed at that, or when that's your goal, that's your ultimate goal, you end up creating a soft culture, and it's very, very tender. It's very difficult to maintain that, and so you end up having to create cancel culture. So that would be one of the big third points that I would make on this, is that this is certainly one of the leading causes, if not one of the main factors, of the fact that we're dealing with cancel culture now. Because if people are being trained that their happiness and fulfillment in life are related completely upon their environment and external circumstances, then they're always seeking to control those, because they want to remove the stresses of life. They want to remove the difficulties of life. Now, I will say that there's tremendous crossover here with the critical theories of the past, with critical race theory, with Marxism, with LGBT gender theories, etc. Because the ideas in those worldviews is that you have classism, and you need to get rid of the oppressors to free those who are oppressed. So you do have that class conflict there. So that certainly is contributing to cancel culture. But here's where I think innocently, some people are not on board with the culture wars. They just want to live their life. But what they've bought to more innocently than approaching these from they don't realize that they've bought into these other worldviews. But what they have done is that they are selfish and they want to be happy. And so they say, you know what? I'm not going to be happy if I hear this opinion that I don't like. This causes me to question myself. This causes me to have doubt. And so I don't like that, and I must get rid of that for the sake of my mental health. And so I think it's sad, but I do think that's so pervasive. This is, well, let's just put it this way. Whenever you have like a conservative speaker going to a major university, one of the things that they do is they break out the crying rooms. I mean, these are college age adults. They break out the rooms for crying. They have the safe spaces where you can go talk to counselors now. And this is what you just think about. What in the world are you afraid of? I mean, literally, this person is just telling you an idea or advocating for something. And that's not dangerous, except it is if you've bought into this idea of mental health. Remember the secular view of mental health, where you think that these stressors are what cause you problems. These are the issues. The external factors are all the issues. It is not what's going on the inside as much as all these environmental concerns. And so you need to control those. And that's why all these universities are also trying to control these factors of who comes speak, all these things, because part of this is an attempt to control these environments. And so, a lot of times we do rightfully understand that this is a culture war with regard to the critical theories of Marxism and things like that. We've talked about that before, but we also need to understand that perhaps a little more innocently, people they don't have another way of processing things. And this is the way that they've been trained to deal with life, is that in order to be happy, in order to find fulfillment in their life, that they're going to have to control their environment. And that's what they're trying to do by creating these safe spaces, etc. And so I think understanding that is important. But again, how much different is this from the Christian worldview, where we understand that there's a lot more behind this? Controlling our environment is not it's not really that important with regard to you can go through anything, and as a Christian, it's your responsibility to respond rightly no matter what. And so that's an important point. Now another I guess this would be the fourth issue that I would put out, is that when people label things as mental health issues, they often subvert the real issue, which would be sin. And this is, again, something that Christians can't get behind because sin is what causes problems. And so I already mentioned anxiety as an illustration. So anxiety is a sin, according to the Bible, 100%. You can't get away from that. The Bible has a lot to say about fighting against anxiety and rectifying that. And so this is an important dividing line where the Bible is talking about an issue and saying this is how we need to act in these kinds of areas. And it's an internal heart issue. It's not the external issue. But a lot of times, using the mental health terminology, you're softening things, saying, "Oh, anxiety, it's not a big deal. It's just part of dealing with mental health issues." But really, it's sin that needs to be confessed and forsaken. And I think that's often important. Now, according to, obviously anxiety is a sin according to the Bible, but a lot of times this is where people would say, well, listen, anxiety is not the sin. What really is the issue here is the toxic relationships that you're a part of. So maybe you need to get rid of your parents. How many times has a child been transitioning, as people often describe it, and their parents are trying to speak truth and love into their life, and so the child says, "No, that's not helping me. So your relationship is toxic, and I'm cutting that off." And that's extremely sad. Where this individual says, "You know what? I can't put up with this." And this, again, buying into this whole framework of my mental health needs to remove these negative, toxic influences. And so our circumstances are never an excuse for sin. And by using that terminology, we often subvert the issues, right? So that's why, again, I want to urge caution. I think as believers, we need to say, listen, there's a time and a place, which is almost every place and every time, to say, listen, the Bible speaks clearly that this is a sin. And, I know it's tempting to just use the world's way of describing things, but no, don't call anxiety a mental health issue. Call it like the Bible talks about, a sin that can be dealt with, and you can have true hope found in Jesus Christ. And that's where we ought to be turning our circumstances. Now, I think if I want to give one more, the last one that I would give with regard to thinking about mental health issues from a biblical worldview would be that the Bible teaches us that we live in a broken world and sadness is a normal part of life. And so we talked about sin being an issue. So some of these things that people call mental health issues are actually just sins that the Bible speaks clearly against and that we would need to deal with those. So another thing would be like angry or emotional outbursts. Those things are talked about as sin in the Bible. We need to be self-controlled, and there's ways that the Bible talks about how we put off the things of the flesh and put on the Lord Jesus Christ. That's how real change and hopeful change takes place. Absolutely. But alternatively, there are things that are described as mental health issues that people are taught they need to avoid when really that's part of living in a fallen world. And so here's where, and this is important to me because this semester I'm teaching through the book of Ecclesiastes for one of my classes. And, I just keep thinking to myself, we really need to be referring to life as something that's viewed through an Ecclesiastes worldview. And what I mean by that is that Ecclesiastes especially, but really the whole Bible tells us that suffering, pain, agony, all of that is part of living in a fallen world. But remember, in a secular worldview, these things are to be avoided at all costs, and there's no explanatory power in anything like a fall or sin or total depravity. So the secularist is really struggling in all of that. But the Bible teaches that, losing a loved one, that's going to happen. And if you never think about that, you are going to crumble when it actually happens. But that is a normal thing. I mean, I say normal meaning that it's our expected experience in living in a fallen world. And here's the crazy thing. The Bible nowhere says that you're supposed to be okay with that or that it's wrong to be sad about that. In fact, it's okay to weep. It's right to cry. That might be the only time I ever say that. But it's right to cry sometimes, especially when I have to tell my kids not to cry all the time. But sometimes it's okay. It's okay. In fact, Paul commands it in Romans 12. He says, weep with those who weep. See, the reality is sometimes we avoid sorrow and we want to avoid it like the plague. And we just say, no. If anything makes me sad, I just need to avoid that. So people turn to alcohol, people turn to drugs, people turn to any kind of form of entertainment just because they don't want to be sad. But the reality is that sadness is actually good for us. I know that's weird and it seems almost paradoxical, but sadness is really good for us. Allowing yourself to suffer, not trying to deny yourself that privilege. It teaches you something that, and again, I'm talking about this from a biblical worldview. The world just has no idea what I'm talking about right now. But sorrow and sadness teach us something as Christians about God and his provision and his care for us and his love for us that we could not learn otherwise, right? I mean, you can't read the Psalms, for crying out loud, and come away with the idea that, oh yeah, the psalmists were always happy. There was never any benefit to their suffering. No, the exact opposite. Psalm 119 is filled with some of my favorite phrases about suffering. The psalmist says, before I was afflicted, I went astray. But now, post-affliction, I love you. I love your law. It is so good for me that I was afflicted that I might know your law. And so all of these phrases show up time and time again. We see that the Bible expects us to go through those things. And it's interesting, even the whole concept of losing your appetite. A lot of times people say, oh yeah, losing your appetite, sure sign of mental health struggles there, blah, blah, blah. But again, the Bible assumes that there's going to be plenty of times that you lose your appetite because of the sorrows of this world. And Matthew 9 is one of my go-to passages for that, because Jesus himself, he's challenged saying, why don't you or your disciples fast? I mean, how come the disciples of John and your disciples don't fast? Why isn't that an issue? Everyone else, the Pharisees fast, and shouldn't we be like the Pharisees? And Jesus tells them in Matthew 9:15, the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. In other words, days are coming when you will be sorrowful, and it will be natural that you fast. And see, I just think we're in such a prosperous society right now in the Western world, especially. And in dealing with things, we just have forgotten that sorrow, sadness, not having things, lacking items, not having our daily bread, those things are natural, or they have been the common experience for so many people throughout all of history, for the majority of people through the majority of history. And so I think it's important to recognize that this should be our understanding of normal, or living in a fallen world. I mentioned the Ecclesiastes worldview. I just went through the first chapters just to find a few passages. They're all over the place in Ecclesiastes. And I love how the author, Solomon, just really zeroes in on how difficult life is. In Ecclesiastes 2:22 through 23, he says, "What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity." Now, I take a positive view of Ecclesiastes more so than a lot of people and interpreters. I don't think Solomon is just saying life isn't even worth living because it's hard. I think he even talks about periodically throughout Ecclesiastes how life is filled with joy. But one of the things that I think we understand when we put scripture together, and even in the book of Ecclesiastes, is that true Christian joy and happiness are possible. They are, but they're not found in circumstances. That's the issue. And so there's a change in how we're seeking fulfillment in life. For the Christian, we understand that we don't need to get rid of our circumstances. We don't need to change our circumstances. We don't need safe spaces to be happy or to be content or anything like that. All we need is Jesus. I know that sounds so cliche, but it's so true, and we need to live like that. We profess those things. We profess that you can have all this world, just give me Jesus. But we need to live that way. We need to absolutely live that way. And so, as I remember MacArthur giving an example one time in one of his sermons, that in all of the material that we have on Jesus, all the Gospels and Acts references and all of that, it's interesting that Jesus is never referred to as laughing or smiling or anything like that. Rather, he's referred to as the man of sorrows, as weeping, as sorrowful, burdened. And I just think that that's, in many ways, the emblem of the Christian life is we are weighed down by sorrows of life at times. That doesn't mean we can't be happy, like I said. But realistically, if we're seeking to alleviate all of the struggles and trials and difficulties of life, that's a surefire way to never be happy, because the Bible teaches us to expect difficulty. And I love that realism. And I think that we really do a disservice if we're trying to train ourselves saying we need to deal with circumstances rather than actually deal with our own heart and with our ability through Christ to put our faith and trust in Him alone for assurance and for joy and happiness. When that is the case, anything can happen in our life. Earthquake, famine, death, all sickness, all these things, and we're unshakable because of our relationship in Christ. And so how do I summarize all this then? So, should you use the term mental health? Well, if you want to use that term, just be forewarned, right? Because the world is not using that term the same way you are. The world has its presuppositions about how to deal with problems. And that involves, remember, in dealing with what problems are, it's going to be environmental factors or biological factors. For us, we recognize that the world is broken and we can't fix that generically. And even more so, we are broken. Our hearts are broken. And so we're dealing with sin on the inside as well. And so if you want to use the term, I'm not going to ostracize you, but you just have to be careful. And know that the world is not using it the same way you are. And I would never advocate for it. I don't think that Christians should use it, but it's not an issue to break fellowship over or anything like that. It's such a common term in our world now that it's probably impossible in some cases not to use it. And so I fully acknowledge that. But as biblical Christians, we want to be thinking about things from a biblical worldview, not embracing the secular worldview. And you cannot embrace the implications of those who have espoused this mental health worldview. And so we live in a broken world. That doesn't mean that we can't be happy. There is tremendous joy and fulfillment in serving the Lord and seeing Him provide for us. Absolutely. But at the same time, we just need to understand that we live in a broken world and we will suffer. We will see death. We will see sickness, and we'll see all those things until Christ returns. And so it's best to be prepared for that. And so we can prepare ourselves to deal with those issues biblically. Well, I hope this issue has been resolved adequately for you, and always love to hear from you. If you would like to reach out, you can find the contact form on my website, petergaiman.com. If you're interested about the seminary where I teach, you can visit shepherds.edu. Always enjoy hearing from you all. I'm still way behind on communication with many of you, but thank you for reaching out, and Lord willing, over the summer, I'll be able to get back to many of you who've reached out. Thanks for listening. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and make His face shine upon you.